You're listening to the PropTech Pioneers podcast. This podcast brings startups and MLSs closer together by exploring the beauty and the struggle of real estate data and technology. I believe real estate is on the cusp of a major transformation driven by better access to data, a new crop of pragmatic founders, and pent-up frustration with the status quo. These are conversations with those pioneers that are leading that transformation within the MLS landscape. I'm your host, Evan Knowles. I'm an entrepreneur building a fintech company called Simba that helps realtors manage their financial health using MLS data. And I wish I had access to these conversations earlier in my journey. So I thought I'd help future entrepreneurs and MLS executives learn from each other in a more open and accessible fashion. I hope you enjoy. Now let's jump into it. All right, welcome back to PropTech Pioneers. You've got Evan Knowles here, your host, and this week I'm with Amy Gorce, who is with REdistribute, and I've been really looking forward to this conversation. We connected at RESO in San Antonio, briefly connecting, got to chat and learn a bit about what you're working on, which is super exciting, and looking forward to diving into that on this conversation. But I think you have such a unique perspective on the industry that I'm looking forward to diving into, because you've been on the MLS exec side. You've been a CEO of an MLS. You've been a technology executive with Clarity and CoreLogic. We just had the CIO of CoreLogic on the last episode. And so I'm looking forward to kind of diving into that space that you're able to play in between. I think you're going to have a lot of unique perspectives. So on this episode, we're going to talk a bit about the flow of MLS data, monetization of it, questions about how the industry can begin to realize the value of this data is what this conversation is about. So Amy, thanks for joining. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting. I'm a little bit of a podcast novice, but I've been a listener of your podcast, and I think you're bringing up some really great conversations that need to be had. So thanks for inviting me.
Well, if you can get on the stage of InMen, and I've seen you on other stages, this will be easy. So let's just dive in. I mentioned, you have a very unique background, one that gives you a ton of, I think, leverage to navigate so many conversations. Dive into that background on how, one, you entered the space, and then kind of go through the major milestones of your career so far.
Sure, you got it. Thanks again for having me. Started in this, I guess I probably technically started in this business when I was 8 years old and my mom got her real estate broker's license. So I was raised in real estate, no question. Went to school, got an accounting degree, had kind of in the 80s, the accounting systems were the IT, right? There wasn't a whole lot of IT systems beyond accounting in those days. And so worked in behavioral health care right out of college and had the opportunity to go to work for Intermountain MLS. It wasn't Intermountain MLS then, it was just a small regional MLS. As their MLS director, eventually became the CEO and went through a rebrand and a massive consolidation in that area that took 6 MLSs down to 1. So it does happen. I know there's people that still think there's too many, and there probably is, but consolidation is not a new trend. We've been doing it since the 90s at least. And so served as the CEO of Intermountain MLS until late 2004, early 2005, where I had the opportunity to found Clarity with Greg Larson, Troy Reck, Kevin Hughes, a few of the folks, well-known folks, Matt Cohen, Paul Heffman. And it was just a real joy to be a founder kind of post 99, 2000, when there was kind of that first wave of money. For those of you founders that weren't here for then, we had a very similar wave of money to the one we just experienced, not quite at that scale, but Zillow and many others that you still see today were born in those days. And had that opportunity to do a bootstrap startup, which I think's sort of the heartbreak of where we are today is you can't even do that anymore, right? You really can't. Greg Robertson and I bemoan a lot, kind of those days of being able to just bootstrap your own company are almost gone because you're competing against all this capital being raised in other areas. So we all of us with our founder Greg Larson kind of kicked in and bootstrapped Clarity. I call it a 13-year startup. It was not an overnight success, but it was a bunch of folks who really were committed to the industry, that saw a problem that needed to be solved, very specific to, ironically, the value of the MLS data. And what was happening then was a lot of subscription sharing, a lot of not necessarily hacking like we've seen recently. They were coming right through the front door with legitimate credentials, but they were sharing those as credentials. So there was a lot of leakage of MLS revenue as a result. So that was sort of the foundation of Clarity, along with some significant background around just InfoSec and security overall. Matt Cohen, my colleague there, still works in that space and is one of my trusted resources when it comes to that topic. And so spent 13 years really evolving Clarity, but always for me, I stayed connected to MLS policy and kind of the advisory services side of things too. At Clarity, we did have a consulting arm, and so as we were bootstrapping it, of course, the consulting revenue was helping to get this company off the ground. So I spent a lot of time with MLSs on strategy and policy and a lot of those things, and really just stayed engaged with that kind of the whole way through my career. I didn't necessarily step away from that. It was just more of a passion project. I led the data access concepts work group and a few years ago that resulted in some of the policies that you see in place today. And so 2017 we sold the company to CoreLogic, and I had the privilege of staying on board with CoreLogic. Spent 4 years on the executive team of the real estate group over there, and really proud of the work we did and the opportunity that I personally had. I'd only worked for small companies before that, and so it was a really valuable experience that I recommend people try once to really kind of understand some of the whys when we ask, why do they do it that way? Or why did things take so long? And I think you really begin to get those insights when you work inside what was then a very large publicly traded company. Obviously, they've gone private since then. When they were acquired by Stone Point Capital, I took the opportunity to take the summer off and try to figure out what was next for me. I knew I really wanted to contribute to the industry in a much more meaningful way and get to help solve bigger challenges that we were already seeing, kind of these lawsuits and the value of the data and the evolution of data policy coming about. And so took the summer off, and then my current business partner Chris Bennett at Presta Team Consulting called me and said, let's start this consulting firm. I have some really good ideas, and so we sort of convinced each other to to get back to work and launch the consulting firm. And one of our largest clients is REdistribute. So, I'm acting CEO of REdistribute, but we do still have our consulting firm where we consult primarily on data strategy. We help startups better understand and navigate the space. We try to help them understand it before they go to market. Usually when they get to us, they're like, help us get to market. And we're like, show me the plan you built.
It might be too late.
Yeah. So it's just been really a lot of fun, but without question, my passion project and where I'm spending a lot of my time these days is, as the CEO of REdistribute, really trying to modernize the way data gets licensed out. Again, today our focus is primarily in the capital markets, in institutional buyer space, because that's frankly what MLSs can understand and are used to. The fact that banks need their data to make transactions work, right? So I think the idea with REdistribute is to really put more value and transparency into a process that's just really kind of been piecemealed together, I'll say, right? We know there's folks that make a lot of money today just scraping the data because they need it. And so we're not interested necessarily in trying to put the data back into the bottle. We're trying to get it out to the folks who need it in a meaningful way with proper attribution, licensing, where necessary, licensing and revenue But I'd say the, kind of number one goal is better transparency, because I think what we've seen with this sort of push pull with MLSs is, a lot of their data kind of being pirated and misused in some ways. But part of that is that the industry hasn't really sort of, kind of come together and said, okay, beyond brokers needing to use it in their business, what are the other value buckets we should be taking advantage of? And that's really where REdistribute's stepping in and kind of providing a new bucket of opportunity for MLSs. So
Yeah,
I think
great.
that
Well,
brings
I'm
you
really,
from the 90s to today.
yeah. Well, I can't wait to dig into the data piece and what you're doing with
Yeah.
REdistribute. But I wanted to ask before we get to that, what was your biggest takeaway and learning from being at CoreLogic? It seems like just such a behemoth. There's so much data that they're collecting and leveraging to create value out in the world, even well outside of the real estate industry. So
Mhm.
that's a big organization to be part of. Like you mentioned, it was
Yeah.
public at one point, went private. What was your biggest learning from that experience?
Yeah. I think my biggest learning is that there's a lot of value when you can operate at scale. And there's a lot of customer value that comes from working with a partner that can operate at scale as well. And so while my role was inside the real estate solutions, which was actually one of their smaller business units, you certainly, because I ran sales and business development, got to collaborate with my colleagues that were in mortgage and servicing, other areas of the business. And I'd say my biggest takeaway is that when you can operate at scale, you can deliver a lot of innovation and value, but it also takes you quite a lot longer than a startup would, right? And there's good reason for that in most cases, not all. But when you're a publicly traded company, you certainly are being managed by infosec policies and compliance groups, and the attorneys have a say, right, and the accountants have a say. And so it does take a bit longer sometimes to get through the decision process. But I'll say, from my experience, it was really run, I looked at the corporation almost like my VC, if you will. And so we had to present, really justified business plans when we wanted to do something different, and or build something new. And I think that's an important part that probably isn't necessarily always understood by the industry. They just look at CoreLogic and say, oh, they have billions of dollars, why don't they just build a new matrix, right? There has to be funding for that. So not to fully defend my former employer, but I think I got a lot of insight that from the outside, it was easier for me to throw darts than when I got in there and really understood kind of, how things get built and how decisions get made.
Yeah, makes
Yeah.
sense. Yeah, that's great insight. And now I think to start and set the context for kind of the meat of discussion today, I'm always curious to ask executives in the space how they personally would describe, the residential real estate data market and how the data flows within the industry and that landscape. So if you were to pull somebody off the street that didn't know what an MLS was or where MLS data lives or real estate data, that they look at that house and they say, what attributes about that house are kept online? If you were to take somebody off the street, didn't know anything about real estate data, how would you concisely describe the landscape to them? Hard task, I am sure.
That
But I'm
is a
always
hard
curious to
task.
ask this.
Standardized fragmentation? No. Yeah, listen, I think it is a hard question to always answer. I think I always describe the MLS itself as a marketplace, and the sort of the folks that you can rely upon to produce accurate, timely market insights, because there's no one else beyond the MLS that has the volume of data about what's happening right now, right? And I've heard kind of parallel comparisons to stock market data and things like that. They're not an exact match, but I think if I were to describe to somebody on the street that maybe didn't know what an MLS was, I would describe it as an aggregation of data that helps you to understand the local housing market. But the difference between them and the stock market being there's 500 and whatever the number is today of them in each local market, as opposed to kind of that single source that I think especially VCs and others look for, right? How can we consolidate this into a manageable source of data and certainly an acknowledgement that that can be a pain point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a collaboration of brokers within a given market to create competition via transparent data and transparent compensation is kind of a definition I've come out
I
of
like
so
it.
many conversations
See,
and gotten
I've
to.
been here for 26 years and you have a better definition than I do.
That's funny. But the next question is the flow of that data. I'm more
Yeah.
curious also about, I'm an insurance company, underwriting, and I want access to this data. In today's environment, how do I do that?
Sure.
And when I say today's environment, let's tee REdistribute up, or other companies in the industry that you want to point to. Let's tee them up by today, prior to REdistribute existing. How would they do that?
Sure. Sure. Well, even prior to REdistribute existing, there's large aggregators that legitimately license this data. They do the heavy lifting of going MLS to MLS, licensing the data for specific permitted uses that then they can license out. Some really good examples. Obviously, CoreLogic, my former employer, is one good example. They've had a program in place that actually compensates MLSs back, based on certain products in their product portfolio that they sell. Again, I think a great program. I think the challenge has been that MLSs don't get to see, how their data is being used or what the real value is, because they're sort of cut off from that component of it. And so, and the same, there's other examples, Black Knight, Clear Capital, right? I think everybody kind of knows who these large aggregators are that they can get listing data from. And I think, where REdistribute hopes to add value is in both creating more transparency, but also participating in that value kind of as it hops its way along in the process, right? And so, if you look at data licensing in kind of the MLS world today, it's largely focused on how do we provide the most value to our brokers, and so they're really charging as little as possible in most cases to the brokers to get that data into their hands so that they can do their business. When we think about that data being used to build an AVM, for example, that's going to make millions of dollars, all of a sudden the value dynamics of charging a broker $30 a month or something like that for that data don't make any sense, right? The MLSs really need the way to collaborate with these large aggregators, or in some cases, maybe the insurance companies or the banks directly. The challenge with that being the financial institutions, these institutional buyers in general, have zero interest in going and navigating, 500 individual MLSs and their kind of licensing process, even if they're sort of modernized enough to understand that there's a lot of value in doing something like that. And so that's really where REdistribute just, looked at something that's really evolved over time and a ton of value has been created, but the MLSs and the brokers who are the original content creators have been really cut off from a lot of the value that's been created. And so, our goal isn't to kind of put a, walled garden around this data. It's exactly the opposite. We want to get it. We want as many people who want to use it as possible using it within our permissible rights and with proper compensation. And so that's really, kind of the goal.
Yeah. And from a technical perspective, is this kind of how it works? Is the MLSs have the data? They've got that data stored in either their MLS vendor, or maybe they've got their own tech. And then the aggregators come along and they integrate with that data, have it real time, and they clean it up. I'm sure they do some things to make it way more ingestible by their clients. And then, so if that's how that works, how does REdistribute help with the idea of, okay, the data is left the MLS, and how do we get transparency into what it's being used so that we make sure that our value there is being exchanged correctly? What's that look like from a technical perspective, and you providing value on that front?
I mean, from a technical perspective, we're doing a lot of the same things a large aggregator would do, right? Ingesting, normalizing, cleaning it up, reaching out to the MLS when we find errors, seeing if we can get those resolved. So that part of the value chain is probably very similar to what the existing large aggregators are doing today. I'd say because we had the benefit of starting last year, we've been able to leverage the benefit of, kind of mapping to the RESO standards. Surprise, even when we get RESO compliant feeds, they all can be mapped differently, as you know. And so we still spend, less time if they're already RESO compliant, but still some time kind of mapping to a standard with a very specific focus on how institutional buyers use that data. So, we do focus heavily on critical fields for these specific use cases around valuation, risk management, things like that. From there, I think where we diverge and where we add value in the process is through, again, that transparency process. And so one of the things that REdistribute does when they license data out is there's a restriction on relicensing of that data. So that if someone wants to relicense that data, it has to be via a 3-way agreement with REdistribute so that we have full visibility and can say with confidence. Now, that doesn't mean we're going back to all of our data contributors and saying, here's the list of people that have their data. But what we are able to do is when they come to us and they say, I found my data on XYZ, did that come from you all? We can say with confidence it did or it did not. And we can't do that if we don't have that level of transparency. And that just doesn't exist today with the other, with the data aggregators that are serving the market today. And it's not their fault. They're not required to deliver that level of transparency today. So I don't want to imply at all that anybody's trying to hide the ball. They're following license agreements, right? But the market has become so robust since some of these programs were created 15 years ago that, folks get their hands on the data and they think, well, now I'll just do whatever I want with it, right? And, not just that proper compensation isn't coming back, but then we don't have any visibility into, kind of where that data has ended up or what it's being used for.
Yeah, makes sense. And I want to get into here just a bit into, what the data is being used for and reasons that MLSs and MLS execs potentially could be worried about where that data is flowing. So we could talk about that in a moment. Before
Sure.
we get to that, I also want to kind of tee that up with, I love what you all are doing when it comes to your mission of, you said it just a little while ago, you're not trying to create a walled garden around it. You're trying to do the opposite and make it so much more accessible. Because I think what that does is, me coming from a totally naive position into this industry and not really seeing it, but having a deep understanding of many other industries and how data works, especially, for instance, fintech. I had this perception of maybe the industry really doesn't understand its value when it comes to data because it just isn't open yet. And when you don't have it open and you don't have it easily accessible, it makes it really hard to actually understand and arrive to a place of value because you don't know who's willing to pay for it if they can't get access to it. And so I love that concept of, hey, let's figure out how to make it more accessible and transparent so we get more people in here playing with it or leveraging it. And I think, again, I alluded to fintech because I think what happened in the fintech industry that I'm trying to connect the dots between that industry and this industry is when a lot of banks started opening up their APIs and allowing aggregators like Plaid to come in and expose that data to developers. What you ended up seeing was some bankers were scared and were late to join that network. And they said, I'm not sure I want to join that. I want to hold our data and be protectionist of it. But what ended up happening was a wave of people joined those networks and aggregators that allowed developers to play with the data. And what ended up happening was these large banks that maybe were slow to move or community banks that were slow to move, there was a moment where so many developers were building net new solutions and building so many great, neo banks, applications for new types of lending that, a large bank or even a community bank just aren't built to service because they're focused on their own unique thing. And so actually by opening their data up, they allowed much more of an entrepreneurial ecosystem and much more value of the data that they actually possess in their accounts and the transactions going through their accounts. And they allowed consumers to access those bank accounts in so many new ways. And so the value of a bank theoretically went way up in that standpoint because their data was being leveraged by so much more. And so the first movers on Plaid and the ones that embrace that, end up seeing the most kind of value creation. And so I love that mission for you all. How do you see that playing out in the MLS landscape, and are the MLS execs and is the industry embracing of that idea of the more we open this up, the more value we can achieve and more revenue we can get and stop relying so much on dues? Is that beginning to be talked about a lot more and understood?
I would say we are in, our infancy on on the level of understanding of what the value is outside of kind of those traditional purposes, because I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that these MLSs are still run by a group of volunteer real estate brokers who have their own ideas about how the data should and should not be used. And so many times I think you'll have an MLS executive that may very well understand it, but helping create policy that allows it can be a little bit challenging sometimes. I would say that for the most part, I think everyone, all MLSs for the most part, or most MLSs, understand the value of sort of that institutional buyer and how it actually benefits them, right? If the GSEs and the banks have access to better data and they're using that data to make better value decisions that ultimately result in faster, maybe less expensive appraisals, closings, things like that. That's a win for everyone in the real estate industry, right? It's hard to argue with that. And so I think that one, I won't call it a layup because believe it or not, we still have MLSs who won't even go that far. But I think that one's pretty well understood. I think what we're trying to help explore, and by REdistribute having a seat at the table, is what additional opportunities are there that create a lot of opportunity for agents, for brokers, for consumers, and that don't create sort of harm or create risk to a group that's very risk averse, in terms of licensing opportunities. And so, today, I think a lot of MLSs operate at kind of that minimum standard, which is give the data to our members to use in their business according to this policy set largely created by the National Association of Realtors, right? And so when people like us come in, we're giving them kind of this new bucket of opportunity, but we, can only guess about what the size of the bucket is based on what they're willing to let us do. And so, where we drew a line in the sand with REdistribute is, this data has to be licensed and used in a way that's going to focus on that valuation, risk management use case around lending and insurance, and portfolio management around the housing industry is certainly something that's easily embraced. But do I think there's more opportunity that would never harm the industry and might make it better? Sure, I absolutely do. And I think when we can have a seat at the table representing a group of MLSs, we're able to present that opportunity back in a much faster and kind of more 360 way than we see today, which is a 15-year-old data license that has these restrictions around it, that's really starting to stifle innovation because there's opportunities that aren't permitted in the license agreement. And so certainly we have restrictions in our license agreement. I'm not here to suggest we don't. But I think we're able to present that opportunity back directly to the folks that are most impacted and make decisions about, should we make a modification to the license agreement to embrace this opportunity? Fortunately, right now, because we're in startup phase, we have certainly plenty of grass that just needs to be mowed in our institutional buyer space. But we hope to embrace the opportunity to really understand the value of this data, and what the new opportunities are, just as much as the ones we understand today.
And similar to what I described there, with kind of what happened in the fintech space, was that if a bank didn't join the network that Plaid was creating, they were actually not serving their customers. And
Yeah.
so they had to join. Are you seeing similar with REdistribute? You guys are growing extremely fast. Are you seeing
Yeah.
that MLSs are jumping on because they don't have a choice anymore?
I don't know if we're at the point where folks feel like they don't have a choice, but I do think we're at the point where we're going to start see the MLSs that have joined beginning to see a return on that commitment. I won't call it an investment. We do have investors that will get a return on the investment, but our only ask is a license agreement, right? And in exchange, we're just taking out of the gate 20% of top line revenue and distributing it back. expect that to increase as we become profitable. We knew we had to commit to paying for the data right out of the gate as a percentage of the profitability we make. And so I think as those funds start to flow back to the MLSs, and many MLSs may choose to share them back with their brokerages, all of a sudden, if I'm sitting in one market and I'm getting paid for my listings, and I'm sitting in another market and it's, costing me considerable money and I'm not getting any compensation back for contributing listings, if I'm comparing those side by side, certainly there's a compelling argument for, wanting to put my support behind the MLS that's paying me for my content. And so I think we're going to see a natural evolution of that. But I think I'd be over exaggerating if I said we were there today. We're not quite there yet. Yeah.
Makes sense. And one question I've always wondered, I haven't actually dug into this yet on the podcast, so I'm excited to do it. But for the ones that, for MLSs, there's kind of two worlds. You either open it all the way up, just open up APIs, allow anybody to come in and take the data and do what they wish. And then there's the middle ground, which is where we live today. And then, there's sort of the other side, which is very protectionist, which you mentioned a few MLSs still do. I want to understand what are they protecting against? Even the people in that middle where they, are still kind of watching where their data is flowing. What are some examples of where they absolutely wouldn't want their data to flow? Like what are the downsides to just opening it up is what I'm kind of getting at here. What are some examples of that danger?
I mean, I think that there's a certain amount of consumer protection that has to be considered. Now we recognize when their house gets listed, it's on the internet already, right? But I think there is, they have gates in place that allow that consumer to, kind of opt out along the way of each of these various, uses of their data. And then for many MLSs, they have to also allow brokerages to opt out of that process as well. And so, assuming they can get the right tools in place that allow, for both of those things, I don't know that there's a lot of downside to just saying, hey, there may be value here if we just open it up wide. I think, what you may hear is some of the concerns or some of the more predatory practices, like from moving companies, right? Which happens anyway, they're just scraping it or however they need to get it. But some of those predatory practices that really annoy the agents or annoy the consumers. PII, they've got to have some protections around that as well. Do I think that, that I could draw a really logical case for it being a wide open API, just anybody who will pay you should get access? I think that would be challenging for me, because part of how you build value is to protect your intellectual property. And, that compilation is a piece of intellectual property that needs to be properly managed. I've tried to do away with the word protected and instead say properly managed, which means how do I define what the permissible rights are and, frankly, what the value is associated with that permissible right. If somebody wants to license my data to, do a one-time modeling for higher education, that's a lot different than I want to build an AVM that's going to be worth $50 million next year, So, I think just that creating that level of sophistication around data strategy is something that can be a little challenging if you're not operating an MLS at scale. And that's where I think you see them just sort of saying, well, we're required to give the data out to these folks. And so we've got these processes, but unless they're entrusting a vendor like REdistribute as a partner to sort of take care of the risk, they just don't have the bandwidth to be able to, kind of go out and implement some sort of strategy.
Yeah. And last question along these lines is, as a startup founder wanting to get access to this data, there's a lot of hoops to jump through. The procurement of this data and getting access, and that's a very long kind of process to go through and expensive. How do you see this process evolving, and how is REdistribute helping with this? So maybe paint the picture of, I guess I can paint the picture of, experience of going through an MLS, which is, you reach out to the executives and you say, hey, I've got this amazing solution. You either get that from a warm intro via, let's say, a consultant. You meet them at a RESO conference, and you say, hey, we're building this awesome tool for your agents. Are you open to exploring it? And then you have some conversations with the executives, and they say, hey, I've got maybe a tech committee. Can you speak to them and get their thoughts, which are made up of brokers and agents? And you speak with them, and maybe a month goes by, maybe a few weeks go by for that. And then that team kind of thinks about, hey, what do we think about the solution? So then maybe a couple more weeks go by, and then maybe they need permission from their board. Maybe some of these boards are controlling kind of access of tech vendors in the market, because some of these vendors, might be, the incentives might not be there for the broker to take in the incentive, because maybe they're a large brokerage that already provides that tool. So it's all these kind of like hoops, one for approvals, but also just the timeline. By that time, when you get to the board, and hopefully you can get in front of them yourself, a few months have gone by, maybe three months plus. And then you maybe get that approval, and then you've got to go through the technology challenge of getting that data. So it's really hard for founders to plan for that in their fundraising, but also just in their go to market. So that's tough. Where do you see that evolving over time, and where can that improve, and maybe where's REdistribute playing in that?
Yeah. Well, like I said, REdistribute today thinks the market for, broker use of the data is fairly well served. If there are challenges, they're sort of policy and workflow challenges, not access challenges, right? And so I do think, like the evolution of tools like MLS Grid, or even CoreLogic's Trestle, or MLS Aligned, or some of the others certainly helped, right? At least you kind of know, hey, I can go make the request here. Now what happens after you make the request is probably still a little, can be wonky, following local policy. And to your point, we have these same struggles at REdistribute, right? We're waiting for the next board meeting, or we're waiting for the fact that they didn't have a board meeting all summer. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like it's all roses and that's not, kind of a painful part of the process. I do think, to the extent that some of the clients we work with are developing kind of a robust data strategy that says, okay, for these use cases, it looks like this, for these use cases, it looks like this, and for these use cases, it looks like this, and now come on in. I think that's either happening today or very close to happening today. So I do think, in spite of, some of the ongoing challenges, it's a ton better than it even was 5 years ago. Pre kind of really robust adoption of RESO standards, and really robust, adoption of better APIs and things like that. The policy part of it is a challenge, because again, you're not talking about a paid board of directors whose job is to maximize the value of a company, right? You're talking about a group of volunteers who come with the bias of, this is my data. What if I give it to him? What's he going to do with it? And how am I going to keep track of it? And again, some of it's fair, and some of it's probably a little outdated thinking. But I do think when you see these MLSs that are operating at scale, they're heavily focused on their data strategy and how to remove all those pain points, particularly when it's a service that will really benefit their subscribers. I think where they've been burned sometimes, I guess, just to give you some perspective, is they give a data license agreement to a startup, and now the startup kind of uses that as a message that says, I've been sanctioned by your MLS, you should use my tool. Then all of a sudden, if the tool's garbage, the MLS feels like they get some of that blowback, right? They get the calls from the IDX vendor who won't answer the phone, or, their website hasn't been updated in 52 days or something like that. And so, I do think, in their defense, there is, a proper amount of due diligence that should happen before, they just say, go ahead. Do I think it's probably, in need of some modernization? Yes. Do I think there's a lot of great tools that are doing that? Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and as you were talking about that, I think there's kind of a connection to draw here with the Apple App Store, which would be on the opposite end of kind of timeline, but very, very stringent. Hey, I'm going to Apple reviews every app that you can view the MLS as, let's say, a marketplace, a way to get access to members and data similar
Yeah.
to the App Store. And, Apple really runs companies, because we went through it, very stringent,
Yeah.
quality, data protection, privacy, and they review every app. I don't know how they do it. They got so many resources. I mean, they're Apple, but obviously
Scale.
MLSs don't have
They
that.
do it because they have scale.
That's right. And you experience that at CoreLogic. So, they've got scale. MLSs obviously don't have those resources, but that's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum that you kind of described there is, hey, we want to ensure quality for our members and ensure that our brand and our data is being used correctly. And Apple does the exact same thing. It's just, how do we make that process more efficient, standardized, and transparent for us founders? Because it's tough when you go to one market, they do things one way, and you go to another market and you're just trying to build and trying to get the market to trying to get your app to market. Those are tough things to swallow as a founder, and you can often feel helpless as a founder. And so I think there's, that's kind of the aspiration maybe is, hey, let's figure out how to make this much more fast, transparent, similar to the App Store. Now, will it ever get there? I'm not sure, but that's kind of maybe a goal.
Believe it or not, there were a few of us, Mike Wertzer and those of us at Clarity, that tried to create app stores, create this exact concept in 2013, 2014, in association with kind of these MLS dashboards. And I think the vision was right. I think we were probably a little early in our concept, for sure. And then even again, to your point, and Clarity was fortunate enough to have, I think 900,000 subscribers when I left, just creating that scale and then getting the, vendors on board and creating the proper exchange of value, for the vendors and the MLS is where, the challenge is. And I think to the extent that you can, again, have a data strategy that says, hey, data for this use, looks like this and costs this much money. Data for this use looks like this and costs this much money. And then just, have a little more transparency and trust in the process would be helpful. Unfortunately, I think that there's some MLSs that have been burned by, I'm not going to name names or point any fingers, but folks that license data for one purpose, and then all of the sudden it's being used for another purpose that generates millions and millions of dollars that have not benefited either the MLS or the brokers. And so for those that understand the value of their data, they want to find the proper way to capture those opportunities and serve the market. But, anybody who says set the data free and make it free doesn't understand what it costs to really have all those business rules and policies that create a lot of value, from the data. Otherwise, everybody could just go scrape it and there would be a lot of value, but nobody really finds a lot of value in the vendors that are just scraping it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And there's so much value in the environment that's been set up from the MLSs from a collaboration perspective, which is how the data gets there in the first place.
Absolutely.
So, but in the end, I always love to end on kind of a forward-looking vision of, all the amazing guests we've had that have so much experience in the space and or new experience. I think there's a lot to be said about somebody that comes in and has maybe a little bit of a more disruptive or out of the box view of what the future looks like for this space. But what's your vision? Like, what are some things you hope end up happening over the next several years, whether it's with realizing the value of data or some other large trend that you see that's exciting?
Yeah. My vision for right now is that this MLS marketplace sort of figures out how to embrace new opportunities in the face of some challenges, right? I mean, the foundation of the MLS, is this idea of, not just cooperation, but compensation. Obviously, some of that's being challenged. And so my vision is that folks learn, embrace the value beyond compensation, in that they've built these powerful marketplaces that benefit consumers. They benefit, technology, not just startups, but existing vendors too. And so, my vision is that they embrace not just their data strategy, but their overall value proposition and sort of, begin to rethink what value they really bring. And, again, I'll just say it. I think there's a few that probably don't have the resources to operate at scale. And so I hope we'll see continued consolidation where it makes sense and where it benefits the brokers. I don't have a number in my head, but I know a lot of brokers who pay upwards of 7, 8, 9, 10 different MLSs, and they're, not super thrilled about that idea. And so, I think if we can not focus on how many there should be and instead focus on how well they're run and operated and deliver value, I think we're going to end up with the right number of marketplaces.
Nice. Well, Amy, I appreciate you coming on and talking about all these things. It's always fun talking with so many people in the space that just, again, have
keep pushing.
A ton of experience. I'm
keep
pushing.
Asking questions. Sometimes we don't ask because we've just gotten used to it, right? So, so some of us old folks that drove the wagon train across the Oregon Trail, which is sitting a few miles from me here, don't ask the questions anymore because we've just gotten used to it, right? When I built the REdistribute business plan, I knew it was going to probably take us a year and a half to get to data scale. And that's with, the experience that I have of 20 years in this business. And so, I do think it's important to keep having these conversations. And I know you've probably gotten a little blowback on some of them, but don't stop. Keep asking.
No, it's been fun. Despite it's funny, kind of, of course there's blowback, but there's just as much, if not way more, people saying thank you. So that means it's working. If you get both sides, it's working.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Thanks again.
Yeah, you bet. Take care, Evan.